Good afternoon and welcome to another installment of Exploring Our World. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we will be talking about dressing for different weather and season changes in 18th century Virginia. My name is Davia Brown and we are joined by Mark Hutter, who is the Master Tailor for Colonial Williamsburg's Department of Historic Trades and Skills. During this live stream, you are welcome and encouraged to send us questions you have for us to answer in the chat that's available. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark.
My pleasure. Although I have to admit, I might have preferred to be outside. It's a glorious autumn afternoon here in Virginia. And yet this morning was very brisk. I know in the past couple of days we've had nights that have fallen down into the 30s. Today the temperature on Fahrenheit's thermometer will be somewhere around 78 degrees or so. The extreme changes in Virginia's weather are very well documented in the 18th century. Many individuals, Thomas Jefferson notably amongst them, kept very detailed notes of the climate, particularly measuring the weather and the humidity here in Virginia. Travelers to the New World very frequently commented on the extreme climates of the southern colonies and the general difference between North America and the more temperate and moderate and damp nature of England. And so this difference in temperature and the extreme changes in temperature and humidity here obviously impact the way one dresses. 18th century Virginians have no choice but to accommodate the vagaries of Virginia's weather by changing their clothing. In a world where we can't change the thermostat in our households, then we only can control climate in a very personal and intimate way. But it's also important to remember that in that pre-climate controlled world, dressing for the weather is not just something that one does when they're outside. Your home can be heated to a certain degree in the winter months by the fireplace, but you're really only warm within some relatively close proximity of the fire. And the corners of the room or the unheated passage or hall of a house might still be very cold, even though you have to work there or at least pass through there. Conversely, Virginia homes are designed to take advantage of the breezes with doors and windows opposite one another, but they still only cool the house to a certain degree. And so you have to have clothing for the summer months. And as these past couple of days have shown, you may need those garments within a relatively short time or even hours of one another. One anonymous author published a comment on the local newspaper, the Virginia Gazette, in the 1730s, saying that he had seen all seasons in the course of a single day, and the temperature had changed as much as 40 degrees. He had, in fact, frozen in the frigid temperatures of July and sweated in the hot temperatures of January. And so having clothes for the season is crucial to be comfortable and healthy in 18th century Virginia. We have so much that we could talk about today. We've brought a number of garments. I think to help organize our discussion, let's talk primarily about dressing for the heat and humidity of the summer first, and then we'll transition to talking about the depth and damp of the winter as well.
That sounds like a great plan, and that 18th century description also sounds a lot like 21st century Virginia. I don't think that much has changed. So we actually do have a question or rather a comment from the audience. Tina would like for us to discuss how clothing was stored out of season, especially how it was protected against insects, which we also do have a lot of.
Certainly. The 18th century wardrobe is considerable. Despite popular folkloric notions, most people have a quantity of clothing, a considerable quantity of clothing, in part because of the the need of weather, but different occasion, different degree of formality, different work that they're doing. And so there are always garments that are in use and garments that are out of use. And while we think of clothing going primarily in a closet today, 18th century clothing is more often stored flat. And so the garments that are not in use are put on the shelves of wardrobes, in cupboards, laid flat in chests and trunks, or laid flat into drawers. Part of that is because the majority of the weight is in the lower part of the garment. You don't want to stretch it. But part of it is also a closed protection from such things as insects. Putting them into closed drawers and into closed chests is better protection. But there were also means of preventing infestation of insects. Certain herbs are used, but the most effective is camphor. The primary ingredient in mothballs today is available in the 18th century and is put in small bags in chests and drawers. Obviously, some fabrics are more susceptible to the problems of infestation in storage than others. But let's take a quick look at some of the fabrics that go into clothing here. Especially in the summer months, the need for very particular types of fabrics are demanded. The dominant choice you can see well illustrated in the garments on this side of the table. If there is one color that covers Virginia in the 18th century summer, it is white. Plain white linens, white cottons, but silks and wools as well. All four fabrics, silk, cotton, wool, and linen, come in a range of quality, weight, fashion, and price. And so the customer is choosing from amongst them. But you can choose linens that are very durable, something like this Osnaburg shift. A good, strong, firm, unbleached linen. This garment is part of the clothing that is regularly issued to enslaved women working on the plantations of Virginia in the 18th century. She'll receive an Osnaburg shift and an Osnaburg petticoat as part of her summer attire. We'll talk later about the additional garments given in winter. No stockings or shoes at this time of the year, but the linen chosen is what determines the usefulness of it. Something like this linen I'm sure you can even see on the camera, is very light, almost sheer. It's the weight of a sheer curtain or a very fine shirting fabric today. And yet there are garments surviving from the 18th century made of outer garments, like a man's waistcoat or vest, mine in a plain linen today, made of linens that are so transparent as this. So it really bears no weight and doesn't hold any heat. There's a wonderful waistcoat or vest. Waistcoat or waistcoat is an acceptable 18th century pronunciation. But a wonderful garment in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Fine Art, worn by a Philadelphia man, of such a light linen fabric, and yet it's embroidered in beautiful silks along its edge in a floral pattern. So these linens don't mean that they are plain, cheap, or unfashionable garments. They are simply more practical. They are lighter in their weight, lighter in their color, and ultimately more launderable. The fact that these garments are white mean that they can be soaked up and boiled and bleached and laid out in the sun to bleach and dry.
That's actually a really good point, because we had the question from Jeffrey, and also viewers, please keep sending in your questions for us. He wants to know, how often would clothes be cleaned? He imagines that it depends on the fabrics and the garment.
And it depends on how it's worn and how careful you have or have not been while wearing it. And of course, on the temperature. The hotter the temperature, the more one is going to perspire, and then things have to be cleaned. 18th century Americans, the 18th century world is very well aware that health is largely a result of cleanliness.
Right.
So keeping your clothing clean in 18th century in 18th century summer is not just about preventing unpleasant odor. It's about staying healthy. So such things as a shirt are worn once and then are generally sent off to the washerwoman to be cleaned. Things like these linen caps that are frequently mentioned as alternative to hats for men in Virginia's summers, also worn once, maybe twice, and then cleaned. Underdrawers and stockings, these things have to be kept clean and are also needed in quantity. Summer clothing is usually a larger percentage of the clothing in the wardrobe because you are going through it so much more quickly. You don't buy one shirt at a time. You don't buy things like this unlined linen waistcoat one at a time. There's a wonderful set of letters between two brothers from the College of William and Mary. One was already here and the other was about to join his brother. And the brother who was at the college sent some advice about the clothing that his younger brother should bring with him. And he specifically says that you should bring a half dozen white linen waistcoats, cut large so they don't stick to your hide when you perspire. He goes on to say that the heat of Virginia is beyond your conception.
It definitely feels like that.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, I'd also like to mention that we will, in the future, have a program more focused on the more logistics of laundry. So definitely check that out when it is advertised. But going into that letter you mentioned, Christian wants to know, how did people transport their clothing for changing climate?
One doesn't necessarily transport their clothing specifically because of the change in climate, but while traveling, trunks are the most common transport. There are trunks that attach to the back of a carriage, or a trunk that sits on the hood of a carriage called an imperial, and we know that both of those are used here in Virginia. In fact, fairly little traveling occurs during the periods of change in the climate. Many Virginians leave the city to go out to the plantations before the heat of the summer and avoid the extreme temperatures of the city. Likewise, once winter really sets in, you kind of hole up and stay close by.
That makes sense. You had mentioned one of the fabrics was wool, and that's is something a lot of interpreters in the historic area today actually wear, which
Yes.
shocks a lot of our guests. Can you kind of talk a bit more about the difference with wools that are worn in the summer and the winter?
Absolutely. As I commented, silk, cotton, wool, and linen all offer a range of useful weights and qualities of fabric. We say wool, and most people think first of the warmth of wool. There are different woolen fiber can be prepared in different ways to make different qualities, different textures of fabric. Woolens are soft and warming. Think of your winter sweater versus the wool of a man's tropical weight summer suit. That's what we call worsted. The fibers are longer, straighter, and they're spun to a smoother, hard thread, and they can be woven to very light fabrics as well. This piece is worsted. You'll have to take my word for it. I know on camera it probably looks like another plain piece of linen. It actually feels very much like it as well. It's not itchy or scratchy or hairy. It doesn't hold warmth. And it also doesn't hold body filth. Wools are naturally disinclined to absorb the odor of the body. They don't hold the bacteria the way that particularly cottons do. And so there's a very healthful nature in wearing wool. Worsteds, particularly such fabrics as Sagathie and Duroy, names that you might not know in the 21st century, are very common men's suitings throughout the 18th century. But in 1766, a brand new type of wool fabric specifically for summer wear is patented. It's titled Cassimere, Cassimere, and it is an obvious play on the more luxurious cashmere that's coming to Europe from the Middle Eastern world at that point. But it's an English-made fabric. This bottom fabric in blue is a good example of cassimere, and this pair of breeches is made out of it. It's a very thin, light woolen instead of worsted, but the yarns are softly spun, woven into a twill structure, and then very lightly napped, so that the fabric overall is airy and spongy. It breathes very well, but again, it doesn't absorb the filth of the body that would cause it to be odoriferous. It can be laundered. You can't wear it if you can't wash it.
Right.
But if you need to better protect them, then a pair of underdrawers, as I mentioned, is also useful and practical. I should say, drawers in the 18th century are more than just one thing. I refer to these as underdrawers. Lighter, unstructured forms of breeches can be called drawers, but a lot of reference to men, both free and enslaved, in 18th century Virginia mention drawers as summer wear, and reading enough of those descriptions, it becomes apparent that they're actually talking about long drawers, or sometimes called trouser drawers. And so some men in the summer months choose to not wear breeches and will wear trousers or trouser drawers instead of wearing more closely fit breeches and stockings. And for some men, it's not a choice.
Right.
For those enslaved men, in particular, the trousers are amongst the garments issued to them for their summer wear.
Right.
Just as the enslaved woman generally receives the shift and the petticoat that I mentioned, the man receives a shift and a shirt as part of his summer issuance.
Speaking of...
I'm sorry, I said shift and shirt. I meant to say shirt and trousers.
Shirt and trousers, okay. Speaking of men's wear, Savannah actually wants to know about popular accessories for men, and did those change with the seasons?
They do. The most popular accessory for a man in the 18th century is his hat.
Yes.
And while as soon as we start talking about 18th century hats, we think of the ubiquitous cocked hat and its equally ubiquitous black.
Yes.
That's not the only style of hat worn in the 18th century, and it's not even the only color of hat. Here is what we might call a round hat, or sometimes, if the brim is broad enough, called a flapped hat in the 18th century. And while this one is sort of pearl-colored, we see dove-colored and pale gray. They're generally simply categorized as being white, light-colored hats. The light-colored hat is more reflective. It's still a felt, however. Straw hats on women are the norm throughout the 18th century, but straw hats on men are extraordinarily unusual.
Really?
And I have no real explanation as to why that is. There is no advertisement for the sale of men's straw hats here in Williamsburg in the entire 18th century. And for the hundreds upon hundreds of advertisements placed upon the newspaper in attempts to recapture enslaved individuals who have run away, or indentured servants or apprentices who have run away, there's just a scant few references to men in straw hats. A mystery we have yet to solve as to why we just don't see straw hats frequently on men.
Hopefully we'll find that answer one day, because I think straw hats are actually a lot more fun than the other ones, but I'm not a man, so I don't know.
Yeah.
We actually have a question from Jamie about the coats and the waistcoats and the differences in material for summer compared to winter, but then I also add on, you have your waistcoat and your coat on. Would men not wear these in the summer?
It's entirely acceptable for a man in certain situations to leave off either his coat or his waistcoat. You might see a man of business on the street in the most extreme temperatures of the summer wearing only his coat and not a waistcoat below it. Most of the time, a waistcoat is worn. When at work, at labor, that is, it would be acceptable to remove the coat and work in the waistcoat and your shirt, or as one says in the 18th century, to work in your shirt sleeves. And if, say, out in the field of the farm, then one might even take the waistcoat off. But when returning to polite society, when conducting business around town, then usually the coat is put back on.
Right.
A habit that most working men really didn't fall away from until the mid-20th century. You can see plenty of images of American road crews or those building the railroad in the late 19th century, where their coats are laid out in rows while they're working, but they're there to be put on as soon as the work is done, or as soon as they step away from it. So for the most part, in public situations, a man is wearing some sort of sleeved garment. Now, it might be a coat, or it may also be a jacket. So jacket in the 18th century can mean what we would call a vest, or it can mean a short coat, such as this, that could also be described as a coatee. There's a wonderful diary from a young man named John Harrower, who arrived to Virginia in 1774 from Scotland. And writing home, he describes the change in his clothing since he's come here. He says, like every man, he wears a little white cloth coat without lining, such as this one, has no lining to it. He says that his waistcoat and breeches are all of cotton. And he finishes by saying that one would scarce recognize him, as the only thing about him that is black is his head and his feet, meaning his hat and his shoes have remained the more common black. But everything else he's wearing is white.
For the fabrics, we have a question about, from Danielle, were the fabrics and the different cloths imported or made in Virginia?
Some of both. Certainly the single largest import to the 18th century colonies is cloth, sometimes estimated to be about 1/2 the total value of everything that was brought here from all over the world and through England. But that tremendous quantity does not negate domestic manufacture. Primarily linens and wools were being made in this vicinity in the 18th century. Or I really should say primarily linens and wools throughout the colonies. In this vicinity, however, we can add to that cotton. There was cotton grown on Virginia plantations and those further south of here, even though it is not the dominant agricultural product that it becomes at the very end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, and it is secondary to the profit of tobacco and further south rice and indigo. But cotton is grown, spun, and woven. That work is primarily rural work. It's not occurring here in the city. It's plantation work, and it's mostly the labor of the enslaved on the plantation. And the fabrics made are most often then used to create clothing for the enslaved community. Some of it is found in other uses, certainly, but the majority of it seems to become clothing for the enslaved. To sort of transition from summer to winter, the jacket that's laying on the table in front of you is a good example of plantation-made cloth. It's a warp of linen and a weft of wool, often called linsey woolsey, or here in Virginia, very frequently called Virginia cloth, meaning locally made cloth. But this jacket is added to the winter issuance of enslaved women working on the plantation. So note that those enslaved people generally receive clothing in the spring for the summer months and in the autumn for the winter months. So in addition to the shift and petticoat of summer, she'll receive a woolen petticoat and a woolen jacket for winter wear. And likewise, men receive a woolen jacket as well. And stockings and shoes. So the stockings and shoes that weren't given and left them barefoot for summer work are given once a year in autumn in preparation for the coming winter.
Well, we actually have a question too from Tina. Were enslaved people given cloth which they could use to make their own clothing, or were they just given ready-made clothing?
Some of both. It's very difficult to homogenize the experience of the enslaved in 18th century Virginia. It's varied plantation to plantation, individual to individual. The sort of responsibility that one has in the household or on the farmstead also affects the clothing that they are given and the treatment that they receive. And so someone in the household generally receives better clothing and more clothing than an enslaved person working out in the fields. But yes, there are instances of enslaved people being given cloth to then be made into garments by their own hands, but sometimes still under the direction of a tailor. Tailors are brought from the city out to the countryside in the spring and in the autumn to measure, cut, and fit. Sometimes they would remain to also produce the clothing, or might produce an example, and then other hands on the plantation will complete that clothing. Those tailors might also do work for the family of the household in preparation for the change of season, and especially for the coming holidays in winter. The real difference between winter clothing for everyone, free and enslaved, male and female, is in the number and options of layers. Yes, there are heavier fabrics, the woolens versus the worsteds, but it's more the number of layers that you put on that give control over that personal climate. So here in front of you are some underlayers for winter wear. That's an under waistcoat. Certainly you can see it better than our folks at home can, but you might be able to tell that all the seams of this garment are turned to the outside and cast down, so that the inside, laying against the skin, is smoother. It's a flannel. By flannel in the 18th century, we mean wool. No cotton flannels here yet. And that could be worn over the shirt or under the shirt. Another diarist, Colonel Byrd, comments in 1 December that it had grown cold enough that he moved his flannel waistcoat from outside his shirt to under his shirt, and he admitted that it produced the vastest itching.
You know, I've been in costume here in the historic area for 4 years, and I know you've been in historic costuming for a number of years. And
That's a very polite understatement. Thank you.
Well, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I think it oftentimes shocks a lot of our guests too, whether they're here in the summer or in the winter, how comfortable a lot of the costume pieces can be compared to a lot of modern clothing.
Without a doubt.
Yes.
The most common question that I think we hear, and this is not by statistical analysis, but just by years upon years of experience, is, aren't you hot in those clothes? And the winter reversal of that, oh, you must be cold.
Yes.
Which I know is an expression of concern for our well-being on the behalf of our guests. And I think it really stems out of this interest about how do you accommodate the climate in a world where you can't just change the thermostat. Proper fabrics, The flies are also a problem
yes.
here in 18th century summers. That's frequently commented on. But proper fabrics and proper layers. That jacket on the end is a great winter example. You can see it's quilted. So it's a silk satin exterior quilted to a wool batting and has a wool backing behind it as well. Quilted garments are very common in both the masculine and feminine wardrobe. Women's petticoats are often quilted, and they can be worn as an underlayer for warmth. They can be worn as an outer layer so the quilting is seen. Likewise, this jacket for a man could be worn below a coat, as I wear now, if you want the greatest warmth of it. Or it could be worn instead of a coat in some instances, particularly about the household. Although double-breasted clothing has a particular association with hunting in the 18th century, which is a very common autumn and winter activity for which there is specific clothing. Maybe sometime we should do a live stream on sporting clothing of the 18th century.
I'm in favor. Since we have started to shift more towards the winter clothing, we do have some questions about, these beautiful winter cloaks and greatcoats we have. We have a question from Karen. She wants to know, is the beautiful red, she says cape, I think she means cloak, behind us made of wool?
It is.
Mm-hmm.
It is. Cape and cloak are both 18th century terms. Mm-hmm. When we say cloak, we certainly mean a long body covering garment such as this form. This is a man's, and we'll look at a woman's cloak in just a moment. Cape is used to refer to shorter layers. Mm-hmm. And so this cloak has capes about its shoulder. Mm-hmm. There are some shorter forms of outer garments that could be called capes. But very confusingly, the piece around my neck is my cape of my coat or the collar.
Right.
And so when you're reading 18th century documents, advertisements, and descriptions, you need to understand the language in order to correctly interpret them. And don't assume that words haven't changed. As fashion changes, our vocabulary of fashion changes as well. But as soon as we start talking about winter garments, cloaks come immediately to mind. But note that I said the warmth and the ability to adjust to the climate really comes from all those layers we've been discussing. The undergarments, the underdrawers, the underwaistcoat, shirts, jackets. Cloaks are much more about keeping one dry than they are keeping one warm.
Right.
Lots of images of people out of doors in winter in the 18th century don't show a form of topcoat or cloak, but you can't see the layers that they're wearing below. But in those scenes, it may not currently be raining or snowing. Loose from the body, the cloak doesn't provide as much warmth as a more fitted garment does. So we have both. We have cloaks and greatcoats, a form of topcoat. This cloak is a man's. It's a particular type of cloak that buttons up and takes the curious name rokello, or in English often called a rocket.
Right.
On the stand here is a woman's cloak. Would you like to try it on?
Yes, I would be more than happy to try it on.
I'll let you fetch that one.
Yes.
So this cloak ties about the neck. Find the ribbons there. There you are. This is copied from an original that was worn in New England in the 18th century and is now in the collection of the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum in Washington, D.C. It's made of a red wool called broadcloth. In fact, both cloaks and my greatcoat, my green coat, are all broadcloth. But my greatcoat, which I'll show you as well, is slightly different. The red woolen broadcloth is very well fulled so that the surface is napped and dense and essentially has a felted finish atop the woven cloth. It makes it somewhat impermeable, so it will help to shed the water. But the greatcoat that I'm wearing is of a wool called Beaver, and its shaggy surface is made to imitate the beaver's pelt, and the directional texture, the fuzzy texture of the surface of it, helps to shed the water, just like the fur of the animal does. Your cloak has sort of a faux fur on it. That trim is called shag. This is a Turkish mohair shag, so coming from Turkey in the 18th century. Silk shag is also used. It provides decoration. It provides a little bit of additional warmth around the front, especially as you hold it closed with your arms there. It would provide the most warmth if it lined the garment. Men's coats are sometimes lined in shag. Sometimes velvet is used not only on the exterior, but as a lining fabric. But a cloak can be lined in shag. In fact, George Washington bought a cloak for his mother from a Philadelphia merchant named Marchington. It was a purple broadcloth exterior lined in white silk shag, and he paid a whopping £10, 12 shilling for it, an extraordinarily expensive piece. In fact, so much so, it was the only garment that Mary Washington specifically bequeathed in her will to one of her nieces.
She's a very lucky niece. That sounds beautiful. We actually have a question from Jeffrey. He wants to know if it's common to wear a cloak and a greatcoat in the 18th century, and if there are any examples.
I know if Jeffrey means wearing them simultaneously, I know of no reference to that. It's usually one or the other. But many wardrobes do list both in them. They have slightly different purposes. The greatcoat is usually closer, warmer. A cloak, as I said, is more about keeping one dry. And so they both can be used. Some men here in Virginia, ordering their cloaks from London, are very specific about their preference for them. One man orders a cloak. He doesn't specify the color. He says that he favors his clothing for its utility and not its gaiety.
Right.
Even though scarlet, as you see, is the most common color.
It's the best color, too.
Think Little Red Riding Hood. But he goes on to say that he wants a cloak that will turn back a rain for half a day's time out of doors.
Going back to protecting from getting wet, Tina wants to know, is there an 18th century method of waterproofing fabrics?
The fulling of the wool, the broadcloth in particular, is making it somewhat water repellent. I won't say waterproof, but it does help to shed the water. It also it prevents it from absorbing. But when wool becomes wet, it still retains its insulative properties. So even if it is quite damp, it will still be warm to some degree. Other fabrics can be waterproofed. There are oiled silks and oiled linens, which can be found in some forms of greatcoats and cloaks. But they're also used as umbrellas, or more commonly here in the 18th century, referred to as umbrellos, oiled silk and oiled linen umbrellos, which are carried for the rain, but in Virginia also carried for protection from the sun.
Right.
There are several references to, in the southern colonies, Virginia, South Carolina, to umbrellas being very common, and commonly carried by men as well as women, which is a bit shocking particularly to European travelers to the colonies. The umbrella in Europe was still thought of as a dominantly feminine accessory, but that masculine-feminine identification of the object is laid aside for the practical nature of using it in the New World.
Adam wants to know, and this is taking us a bit back to summer clothing, how common was banyan wearing outside of the home instead of other garments during hot weather?
Yeah. Well, that's very Virginian, isn't it? To change season
Yes.
All of a sudden like that. Adam references a garment called a banyan, a loose form of coat or robe. I didn't bring a banyan with us this afternoon, but I brought a gown. And so these loose T-shaped garments that derive initially from the Japanese kimono. That was very dramatic.
It was
wasn't
fantastic.
I couldn't do that again if I tried. So this loose T-shaped garment is referred to as a gown, and the banyan is fitted in its upper body like a coat, but from the chest downward is loose, and so they can flow on the body. Adam's question was whether or not these are frequently worn outside the home. They certainly are in the extreme temperatures of Virginia's summers. There's a depiction of a planter selling his tobacco on the docks, presumably in Norfolk. And in that mid-18th century depiction, the planter is in his gown and cap, as I mentioned earlier, but the merchant is in his coat and hat as they transact business. Fithian, who I mentioned earlier, Philip Vickers Fithian, writes that in those extreme hot days of 1774, the boys in his school stripped to their trousers and shirts, but he wore his breeches, shirt, and gown, a thin linen gown.
Right.
And so he was working and in the presence of the family to whom he was a servant, but still he's dressing practically for the weather.
So we unfortunately have come to the last couple minutes of our time today, and there is something on this table that I really think should be mentioned because it's very timely for what's happening around the country and around the world right now. Would you like to tell us about this item here?
Oh, that was sort of hiding on the other side of the table there. While masks are crucial to our health in the 21st century, masks also have a healthful purpose summer and winter in the 18th century. This sort of mask, which is held to the face by biting on that bead in the interior, is protection from the sun and possibly from burning winds as well. In an age before effective sunscreen and sunblock, masks like this are actually quite commonplace. They don't appear in 18th century images very often. You don't have your portrait painted with your face covered. It's not something that survives very frequently. There are only 2 known masks from the 18th century, both in English collections, or actually one from the 17th century and one from the 18th century. And unlike in the 17th century, when these sorts of masks called vizards or visors were very fashionable and were worn publicly as an ornament and accessory, by the 18th century, they lose their fashionable aspect and retain their practical aspect. There are many, many written references to such masks. We know that they were sold in shops here in town. We can find them in newspapers from Charleston to Boston. We can find them on Young and Old. Patsy Washington was given masks soon after the marriage of her mother to Colonel Washington. An 80-year-old Quaker grandmother in Pennsylvania is recorded as having worn masks such as that while riding. A formerly enslaved African-American woman is discussed wearing a mask while walking in Boston. Unfortunately, she was accused of trying to hide her identity behind the mask instead of simply wearing it practically as any woman might.
Right. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time today. I want to say thank you to Mark Cutter for joining us and giving us such great information about dressing for the weather in 18th century Virginia. I want to thank all of you for watching and for submitting such amazing questions. Wish we had gotten to all of them today. And I also would like to say a big thank you to our donors who have made this program and many other programs possible here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Mark, before we go, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, thank you. This was a great opportunity. There's so much more that we could discuss. We look forward to the opportunity to speak with you about this when you return to Williamsburg. And now you know how to dress for every season here. We'll see you soon.
Yes, we are open, so come and visit. Have a great day.